Good evening, honored guests, dear Ambassador Wittig, dear friends. We are really, really happy that Ilija Trojanow can be here tonight. As you might have heard, the last time he tried to enter the United States some weeks ago, he was denied entry without being given any reasons. At that time, he had already confirmed his participation at this year's festival, New Literature from Europe, here in New York. It then took some extra work, including visa interviews for him and a 30 pages petition from our side to get everything done for the second attempt. And this time it worked, luckily. The fact that a German writer was denied entry into the US is, as far as I can see, unprecedented. One can only speculate about the reasons. Was it politically motivated in the old sense, and then why? Or was it only what you might call a technical procedure? And what could be more disturbing? However it may be, we are really glad that Ilija Trojanow still wanted to come to New York and that he did come in the end. And we hope that in the coming days he will not only have to speak about surveillance and the NSA, but maybe also about literature, his literature. Tonight he will indeed speak about surveillance and the naked world with Liesl Schillinger, New York Times critic and author, and Suzanne Nossel, the executive director of PEN American Center. I would like to take this moment also to thank Suzanne and PEN for their engagement in this matter. I'm excited for a lively discussion, and I hope you will stay for a glass of wine afterwards. Thank you all for coming. Let's give a hand to our panelists.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. We are here tonight for a bunch of reasons that I might call geopolitical serendipity. A few weeks ago, I heard from Goethe-Institut that a terrific novelist had been denied entry to this country. I read his prize-winning novel, The Collector of Worlds, which is about the British explorer Richard Francis Burton, who did a Hajj to Mecca in disguise in the 1850s, and this was the first Westerner to look upon Lake Tanganyika, and who was basically considered a pretty suspicious character by his English employers and by the foreign authorities in the lands where he lived. And so I read this novel to get a sense of the mind of this writer. Ilija, I call him Trojanow, but I guess it's Trojanow, was born in Bulgaria, but was raised in Germany and in Kenya, lived for a while in India. He is what the Germans call a Weltbummler, a world traveler. And he's written many novels and also travel journeys that bring alive the life of other nations and other sensibilities, that write about Islam and the Ganges and so forth. He also, however, wrote a book in 2009, which I have read, called Attack on Freedom, Security Madness, the Surveillance State, and the Breakdown of Civil Rights. And this was a very prophetic book, and in it he talked about how it was that people's privacy had been infringed gradually and then increasingly. In one chapter he compares it to frogs being in a pot of water until it gets too hot, and he says, jump out. But it's a look at basically how in the post-9/11 world, the war on terror has also turned into a war on the privacy of individual citizens. So while I was reading up on that and writing about him and hearing about his visa denial, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel discovered that her phone had been tapped. And this, as we all know, became a subject of intense international interest. And then this Monday, I suddenly found a story in the New York Times that PEN American Center, of which Suzanne Nossel is the head, had been doing a study, polling its writers to see if something called a chilling effect was going on. That's a First Amendment term. And that's the idea that people are afraid to express themselves or to write or to research or whatever because they're afraid they might be punished. And they were seeing if the new privacy laws are in fact affecting that. So I guess my first question was going to be to Suzanne, to ask her, did you find that a chilling effect is being produced by the invasion of privacy perceived of people's data and communications?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank the Goethe-Institut for convening this panel, and it's great to meet Ilija here in New York and to celebrate his ability to enter this country after having been denied. So we're all really pleased you're here. Just to say a few words about our study. So when the revelations of the PRISM program began to come out over the summer as a result of Edward Snowden's leak and his provision of documents to journalists, there were some early polls conducted by Pew that basically showed that many Americans were kind of shrugging their shoulders. You know, they were learning that their phone records, their emails, at the very least the metadata was being collected and stored somewhere in a massive data facility, that there were things like backdoors to allow the government to circumvent encryption, that the government, US government, was able to track and trace social media circles, all these things, and yet the polls seem to show that many Americans kind of were taking this for granted. And you know, part of that perhaps is that there's been a great kind of voluntary forfeiture of privacy that we've all participated in when we buy things online, when we post to our Facebook account or our Twitter. You know, we share more than we ever would have in a non-digital world, and we've become accustomed to that, and we see ads and other evidence that, you know, somewhere, somehow, all of this is being tracked, and they know that we're looking for a new lamp or a new carpet, and we've just come to sort of price that into sort of the cost of doing business in a digital world as an individual. And we were concerned about this, the degree of sort of nonchalance that the American public seemed to have about these revelations, and we wanted to look at whether writers felt the same way. And so we worked with a polling firm that could produce for us a kind of statistically valid scientific survey of PEN members who are a cross-section of writers here in the United States in many different genres: novelists, nonfiction writers, translators, poets, journalists. And we asked them a series of questions about their reaction to these revelations on surveillance, how they feel about knowing that their information is being collected and potentially used in this way. And then we also asked them about whether and to what degree they're changing their behavior. And what we found was, I would say not surprising, but quite stark. So first of all, we found a far greater sense of alarm among writers as compared to the general population about this scope of government data collection programs, where only 44% of Americans disapprove of government surveillance in its current forms. 66% of writers disapprove. So more than 50% more writers disapprove of the government surveillance programs than is true of the overall population. So that was quite stark, and a large percentage, 77%, said they felt that their privacy was under threat, and really as never before. And when we asked people about changes to behavior, those numbers were very stark as well. 28% of our writers said that they curtailed or avoided social media activities because of concerns of about government surveillance. 24% have deliberately avoided certain topics in phone or email conversations, and 16% have avoided writing or speaking about particular topics. And beyond that, significant percentages reported that they had seriously considered taking those kinds of steps to protect themselves as a result of government surveillance. So what we see there is that there are already effects as a result of these surveillance regimes, that people are taking action, they're changing their behavior, and what we are discerning there is a chill on the freedom of speech. And so that's what I think the survey showed.
Did you personally, were you personally active on his behalf with PEN to get him to this country?
We were. We issued a press release. We got a couple of stories in the U.S. media, one in Slate and one in the LA Times, about Ilya's case. I personally made a call to the Department of Homeland Security, only to be told that the government was shut down and that the senior official had absolutely no idea what had gone on in this case, nor did he have any ability to find out because he had no staff on duty. But I think we did raise the attention. I mean, I'm sure that call got reported back, and who knows how these things work. I think, my sense is that in the middle of this whole fracas and scandal with Angela Merkel's cell phone, that they probably didn't want the additional irritant in U.S.-German relations of more clamor on Ilya's case. So they saw fit to set him free, luckily.
And the German pen also wrote a letter in your behalf as well.
They did, yeah.
What did they want to know, and what did they find out?
Well, they wanted to know what they will never find out, and that is, why was I denied access? The funny thing is that the American embassy in Berlin actually wrote me an email saying that we cannot tell you why you were denied access because of privacy laws. And I thought it's so kind of the American government to safeguard my own privacy for me. It's kind of, I don't have to do it on my own now.
Very benevolent. I know
and
that
also a little bit dialectic, yeah.
Yes.
But to answer your question, now the interesting thing is, if American authors have figured out that it's not a good idea to be honest when you're communicating nowadays, surely the terrorists have figured that out meanwhile as well. So it actually raises a question that we're going to have to discuss, and that is, who exactly is most affected by such a development? And is it really efficient in combating terrorism, as is often claimed? Or is it actually far more efficient in combating the freedom of thought? And that, I think, is a very substantial question that we're going to have to discuss. But to come back to your question, it is, I think, interesting that we're speaking about privacy issues that go way beyond the traditional understanding of privacy. First of all, we have I think, a substantial ignorance with a large part of the population as to what digital freedom means. The normal instincts no longer work. One of the examples we give in the book is that, interestingly enough, even proponents of the so-called post-privacy movement, so people who would say that in the era of digital communication, there cannot be any privacy, and there is such a movement, even those people would actually not like people to look over their shoulders when they're reading a newspaper. They feel kind of it's unpleasant when someone opens a letter they might have received. So in a way, we have certain instincts that work in the conventional sphere of communication, but no longer in the digital sphere. That's one thing. The other thing is that actually one of the great things about the last few months is that people have been made aware of the enormous technological possibilities. I remember when we published the book, there were actually many people who thought that we were overstating the case. Basically, there were a lot of critical reviews, and one of the main arguments was, you're exaggerating. Also in terms of what is technologically possible, that in a way we're writing science fiction. And as usual, when you write a book that's, as you said, partly visionary, a few years down the line, people say then you understated your case. And,
exactly.
So that is, I think, one of the positive developments. People are becoming aware of what is technologically possible, and I think that's a necessity for them to develop a critical awareness.
What prompted you to write this book in 2009, as opposed to more recently? Was there a particular incident that set you off?
There wasn't. However, we were both in China, and
his co-author is named Ilija.
Yeah, Ilija, a very good German author, and we were in China, and we were sitting in the hotel bar having a drink, and suddenly we started talking about that, and it was one of these amazing moments when you meet someone who completely shares your understanding, your analysis, your opinions. So it was like really meeting a soulmate in this specialized field of surveillance. And
I'm sorry, who did you meet in this hotel? I don't mean name them.
Yuli and I met.
Oh, that's where you met?
Yeah, we met in Shanghai, yeah.
So clearly writers need to travel for the free exchange of ideas.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for giving me another excuse, yeah. What prompted it, I think, was not so much one particular incident, but the fact that Yuli is also a well-known lawyer, and I did dabble in the study of law. I failed miserably, but I do have an understanding of law. And we noticed that there's been a paradigm shift, that the traditional form we understand human rights and civil rights no longer applies in this new field, in this new area, even amongst people who would call themselves staunchly liberal, democratic, who would actually be probably very proactive in defending certain traditional rights, but would be very kind of passive in regards to digital rights.
In other words, if they see someone spying in the window, they're angry, but knowing that some clerk in a basement is pouring through their email doesn't bother them?
Exactly, and I think the main reason is that, and my personal case now with not being allowed into the US was very, I think, good point, good kind of proof of that. Because it's an attack on the general public, because it kind of diminishes the rights of everyone, people don't seem to take it seriously. While if an individual kind of is attacked, people are then concerned, because the individual case highlights the injustice of it. While the fact that everybody is kind of attacked.
It's a shared burden versus...
It's kind of a shared burden, so it becomes something like, I don't know, like climate change, we're in it together. And
as long as there's no solution, we might as well be part of the problem.
Something like that, yeah.
Well,
sorry.
No, but did any of your writers who said that they worried they were being surveilled or that they would get in trouble, did they report that they had been interfered with, or that someone had called them and said, like a letter from the National Security Agency saying, we want your information? Did they report actual interference?
Some did, and different kinds of situations. I mean, obviously there's the problem, the well-known issue of people have been involved with reporting on government leaks, and those reporters have been targeted very strenuously with prosecution, and the Obama administration, as people know, has been far more aggressive in prosecuting both leakers and journalists who have published leaked information than any prior U.S. administration. So those reporters definitely feel targeted. And we heard about a number of other cases of people undergoing elevated levels of scrutiny in airports and in travels, and because of reporting on stories, and there's a case of somebody who reported on anthrax, the anthrax case in the U.S., and kind of came under scrutiny because of a combination of having reported that story and the fact that some anthrax letters were mailed from a post office just a couple of blocks away from this person's home. So some dots were connected, and this person came under scrutiny. They then kind of cleared it up and it went away. What we don't have, and I think Ilya's right to point out that this is part of the reason for the kind of indifference or nonchalance, is it's so far, I think most people kind of look at it as sort of a victimless crime, that there's no sort of poster child for the writer or journalist who's really gotten kind of caught up in the abyss of this. And I think there are a few cases that are developing. James Risen from the New York Times, as somebody who's being prosecuted in relation to a leak, and Glenn Greenwald, who's now left The Guardian but has been a primary outlet for Edward Snowden's revelations, and who now won't travel here to the United States. And we're doing a program tomorrow on surveillance at Fordham, and he'll be Skyped in.
At what time, in case people would like to?
Our program, it's an evening program that starts at 7, and it's at Fordham Law School in Midtown, at West 60th Street. So if you want to come, get added to the RSVP list and arrive early, because it's going to be oversubscribed. I think people will be really interested to hear what Glenn and we have a fantastic group of panelists and what they have to say. So I think there are a number of individuals who are kind of, gradually becoming the face of this, but...
But sorry, I think that this is one specific example which clarifies the threats and the dangers, and that is research I actually met one of the leading German journalists at the Frankfurt Book Fair, and she was telling me that she relies on anonymity when she talks to sources. And we're not talking necessarily about political issues. It could be economic, it could be anything else. But when you talk to a source, sometimes the source has to be certain that her or his name is not going to be published. So anonymity is a very important part of this relationship of trust. That
authentic journalism.
And not only journalism. I mean, authors like myself whose works are always based on serious research sometimes also meet people who want their anonymity to be safeguarded. Now, if the person you're interviewing is aware of the fact that this anonymity cannot be certified because, I mean, there's just no way. It's not because of my wrongdoing. It's just that the system is such that it will not be safeguarded. Then, of course, he or she will not be inclined to speak out freely, unless she's, of course, courageous and really wants to kind of be known as a whistleblower. So there you have a very precise example of negative effects that are already happening.
Like many people in this room, I imagine, I've been voraciously reading whatever Glenn Greenwald has been writing in the past 6 months. And he wrote in one of his articles, I can't date it, but that when Democrats were polled during the George W. Bush's administration, about 60% opposed the gathering of personal information on Americans. But when President Obama became president, that flipped, and Democrats, 60% supported it. And so the precedent is alarming that, once you make these laws that let the genie out of the box, it's going to serve under whichever administration. Does Penn or do you have recommendations for measures that could be taken to backstep, to put in, after the fact, to put in safeguards, or what do you think can be done? Either of you.
Well, look, I think we all can agree that there's some level of surveillance that is acceptable. We're not saying that there needs to be an absolute ban, that these programs should just be outlawed and abolished, full stop. I think we all take seriously the idea that governments need to protect us, that they have to be able to gather information, that some of this information can prove very useful to thwarting terrorism or other crimes and threats. And so what's missing here, though, and what's so troubling is this kind of wholesale surrender of privacy and the idea that really it's the technological capabilities that are driving this. So what they can collect, they do collect. And the fact that those capabilities have expanded exponentially has become grounds to allow the programs themselves to intrude so fundamentally on what used to be a completely protected zone of our communications with all kinds of people in our professional and personal lives. And so what alarms us is that all of this has happened really almost free of scrutiny or debate. And what we're calling for is a national debate, congressional oversight, and a proper adjudication in the Congress, in the courts, of where these lines are to be drawn. I mean, there is some line that's appropriate here. There's some degree of surveillance that I think we could all agree, we'd happily accept in return for safety and security, but we don't think the place where that line has been drawn today has any basis other than the fact that the capabilities are there, so the prerogatives have been asserted. So that's what needs to happen.
Now, in your book, I think it actually challenges to an extent the idea that we can thwart terrorism if we spend millions of dollars on video surveillance, or if we mine these data communications. Well, say what you were going to say, but I was going to ask you to respond to the idea that, are we right or wrong to think it helps?
One of the most famous early whistleblowers is a man called Bill Binney, who actually helped set up the NSA, and who says that his main line of criticism is not so much civil rights, it's inefficiency. He actually thinks that, if I'm not mistaken, the USA has 16 different secret services or different organizations working in that area. He thinks that 3 is more than enough, and he thinks that actually it's bureaucracy run amok. Now, the ironic thing is that this was the general understanding until '89 that this is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union and the satellite states were inferior, and why the whole system collapsed, because they had this huge bureaucracy which was incredibly inefficient and only was reasonably inefficient in terms of repression, but not in any other field. That was well established, and I can't remember anybody arguing against that. But we're now experiencing a very similar thing. And if it's true that 2 million Americans have Secret Service clearance, it means actually that percentage-wise you have more people working in that field than you had in East Germany. So you can clearly see a kind of monster of data mining and surveillance that has, I think, nothing to do with any logical analysis of, is this useful, is this helpful? It has more to do with the fact that, as you mentioned, first of all, it's technologically possible, and secondly, of course, that it's a state within a state which will never, out of its own, limit its possibilities. You would always have to force bureaucracy to limit what they're doing. You can't expect them kind of to say, well, we're going to take it easy. They will always expand the possibilities of what they can do, which is exactly what happened in Eastern Europe. You actually had a relatively small, brutal, and reasonably efficient organization in the 50s, and it became bigger and bigger and bigger to a point where every fifth adult, in a way, was cooperating with the Secret Service, and it became this huge job creation machine. I mean, I was a student in Munich, and I know now from the Secret Service files that there were 3 adults who were actually charged with reporting on what I was doing as a student, which was more or less nothing. I mean, writing the occasional article or stuff like that. So you can see that actually the only reason for its existence is that it exists. You know, it's kind of a self-gratifying and self-satisfying monster of bureaucracy.
So I want to ask you a very specific question about your book. And in one of the chapters, you say that there is something that Chancellor Merkel said, but you don't say when, and I was going to ask you about that everyone should put on a Post-it and stick on their mouse pad. And this was during I guess in the first few years of the War on Terror. She said, well, we're doing fine for the moment, but nonetheless, we do need more surveillance. And so I was interested to know in what context she said that, but also I was interested, therefore, to know what you hoped she would do this summer. As everyone in this room perhaps knows, it was this summer when Ilija was in Brazil coming to a Germanistics conference in Denver that he was not allowed to get on the plane, and his visa was rescinded.
ESTA.
I'm sorry?
ESTA.
Well, it's called ESTA, yeah. But it was he was not allowed to come to America. And one of the reasons we're all thinking that maybe this happened was that the NSA had been annoyed that he was one of 70,000 people who signed a letter to Chancellor Merkel after the Snowden revolutions.
Well, not quite. I co-wrote the letter, so it's slightly more than the 70,000. But anyway, that's a minor point.
But so you asked the Chancellor to take action. What action did you think
nothing.
She could or should take in that letter?
Well, first of all, she took no action. She didn't even reply to the letter. The only action she took was when she found out that her own mobile phone had been spied upon. Secondly, it's very evident what she has to do. She is, according to the German constitution, which is not quite a constitution, it's a little bit complicated, but it's something like a constitution. She has to safeguard the civil rights of all German citizens. So if the NSA or any other foreign Secret Service organization collects data illegally, according to German law, data on German citizens, she would at least have to try and, within the diplomatic routes, try and find out what has been happening, ask for an explanation, and try and put kind of a structure into place that would stop this from happening again. I mean, this is so basic, it's so evident. The fact that the former government didn't really care about the subject until recently is, I think, a very, very poor expression of their understanding of both the Constitution and the whole concept of democracy.
Well, but of course it's not just Germany, it's France, it's many
Sure,
other
it's everywhere,
countries
it's
where it's
everywhere.
been discovered now that our data hand, invisible hand, reaches out to all of those countries. Suzanne, are you in communication with PENs around the world, in addition to being the executive director of American PEN? Is there discussion about writers who also feel that their privacy is being invaded in other countries? Is this becoming a PEN collective?
Yeah, no,
subject?
it's a very deep concern shared globally, and we had a PEN Congress in September in Reykjavik where we passed a strong resolution on this topic, and I would say it was sort of the hot topic of that meeting. You know, I think though, I mean, as the Americans in the room will know, in our polity here, international opinion is so readily dismissed, and you know, bringing to bear the concerns of international writers, unfortunately, doesn't tend to be a needle mover in a U.S. context. I mean, I think Angela Merkel, because of her stature and the idea that this, and Dilma Rousseff, the idea that this could interfere with U.S. diplomacy and the achievement of U.S. Diplomatic and national security objectives, its ability to work with partners, you know, that I think has turned out to be pretty significant and has moved the debate and certainly kept the issue front burner and helped galvanize action in the Congress to at least look at, you know, what kinds of constraints are needed here. But I think it's the, you know, the fact that this is affecting Americans here at home and communications between Americans and Americans, and that American writers who, you know, even those who have very little to do with colleagues overseas, you know, that level of alarm, I think, you know, in some ways in terms of, you know, the question is how do we move the debate domestically, you know, I think that's potentially, you know, more potent.
Mm-hmm.
Just want to add one thing because it's important. I don't think the German government has learned anything from what happened the last few months. Actually, for those who are not Germans, at the moment there are coalition talks between the two major parties. And within these coalition talks, privacy laws and data security is not an issue at all. However, the Interior Minister has asked for very far-reaching rights. Basically, he would like the German Secret Services, BND, Verfassungsschutz and others, to have a similar access to individual data as the NSA has. So basically the development at the moment is that, oh, if these guys are doing it, we should be able to do it as well. Why are we not doing it? So there's actually a very troubling development and a kind of hypocrisy, because on the rhetorical level, most politicians now, even the conservative politicians in Germany, are expressing some form of, be it disgust or at least mild criticism. But in the coalition talks, they're basically expanding the capabilities of the secret services, or they're planning to expand them.
So I believe you make a point of that in your study, that other countries do tend to follow America's lead in a certain way, so it's disturbing if...
Well, it's certainly the case that the U.S. historically has taken enormous pride in its position as a global leader on free expression, and I've served in the U.S. government, for example, representing the U.S. at the UN on human rights issues, and you know, we always would say that our First Amendment is the most protective free expression law in the world, and that our standard for restricting speech is higher and narrower than any other, than both international law and than any other national law. And so the idea that, you know, and I think this is really true, that over the last few months we've surrendered that leadership position in many ways, and that we're now seen as sort of a leader in encroaching upon the zone of creative freedom and freedom of expression is really very troubling. And I think it's, you know, the idea that we've almost kind of unwittingly surrendered this, kind of all of a sudden it's been undercut, and it wasn't even really a deliberate decision. It was just this kind of creeping set of capabilities that these 16 intelligence agencies began to take advantage of, that now all of a sudden we know about. And now I have to imagine that as U.S. diplomats stand up at the UN to talk about free expression, that their credibility is undercut. and that they're in a much tougher position to do it. I mean, it's interesting what Ilija points out, that, you know, all this kind of Angela Merkel outrage is a bit of sort of ritual howling, and that, you know, the real business is about how do the German security agencies put into place the same capabilities. And I think that, you know, it's sort of, it's one of a piece of, with this kind of nonchalance and indifference, and sense that we've kind of already forfeited all of this, and so we better get used to it. And your point that younger writers, you know, kind of shrug their shoulders, they've changed their behavior, they're no longer taking on certain topics,
but they're not upset about being surveilled.
But yeah, they're sort of, it's you know, they've kind of they've given it up kind of willingly.
Well, you make such a stirring point in one of your chapters in your book, just about how hard people have fought to have individual rights codified and preserved, from the Magna Carta to habeas corpus to the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. How serious do you think the abrogation of these rights is that's been going on for the last 10 or 20 years? Do you think we could seriously just lose them?
I think we've already lost them, partly lost them.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem is that people tend to believe, especially in democracies, that freedom can be institutionalized. They think that something that has been achieved, that is then being codified, is kind of secure. And that is a utter misconception. Especially in technologically changing times, we need to reassess, redefine, defend, and reestablish freedom. And to most people I talk to, that is not very clear. They seem to think that there's some kind of magical carpet of democracy and freedom that will, you know, always take them to wherever they want to go. And they're not aware of the fact that every generation needs to fight their own wars in safeguarding freedom and, of course, expanding them in a very different context. I think that is a major problem. As regards to different rights, I mean, it's evidently clear that we've already lost parts of them. We don't need to now kind of
enemy competence.
Yeah, and habeas corpus and so many other things. I mean, just the very minor matter of the partner of Glenn Greenwald being stopped in London. I mean, that's such a clear break with a certain tradition of not only habeas corpus but also of not misusing law. I mean, they actually the basis for that was anti-terrorism law. So he would have to be someone who was actually potentially involved in terrorism for the British authorities to be allowed to stop him, which was evidently not the case. I mean,
but of course, you write there's recent precedent when Gordon Brown interfered with Iceland when there's a financial crisis, using the Anti-Terrorist Act to freeze their bank accounts. So it looks like there's all kinds of creativity going on right now.
Sure, yeah.
Which is you introduced the book by saying, you know, this is not Oceania in 1984. This is the Bundesrepublik in 2009. But it is feeling a little like George Orwell's 1984 lately. Would you agree that we are moving into a realm that seems fictional?
Well, to tell you a personal story, I was actually surveyed when I was a baby, which is the funny thing, because the flat I was living in Bulgaria was bugged, because we were a joint family, as was usual in Bulgaria, and my uncle was a major figure. He was in the Bulgarian Gulag, he was in jail. He actually blew up a statue of Stalin while Stalin was still alive, so that is not something which was well looked upon. Now, afterwards, after '89, when we had access to the Secret Service files, we found out how they did it, and the effort they went to was incredible. They had to. It's a 4-storied building. They had to get rid of everyone in that building, so they made up stories, having to send different people to different places, so that the building was empty. They went in with 24 different people in order to bug our flat. So it was a major kind of paramilitary operation. Today, all they would have to do is, as Edward Snowden has very clearly explained, would be 3 mouse clicks. I mean, someone like Snowden sitting in Hawaii would just have to click 3 times on the mouse, and he would have the same effect. This story shows you that the pervasiveness and the aggressiveness of surveillance has reached completely new heights. So the only thing safeguarding us is the benevolence of the Secret Service and the intelligence community, that at the moment they don't actually feel that they have to aggressively use that information. But that can easily change, and it has changed. To give you another example, in Austria, where I live in Vienna, they passed, after 9/11, they passed anti-terrorism laws. And then I'm guessing the Secret Service and the Ministry of Justice was really peeved because there are no terrorists in Austria. So they had this wonderful law, but no terrorists. So they probably must have sat together and they must have, spent a lot of time thinking, where do we get some terrorists? And then someone came up with a brilliant idea. Well, they're not really terrorists, but they're animal rights activists. And then someone must have said, yeah, that's quite close enough to terrorism. So there was this huge, incredible court case which went on for 1.5 years, trying to prosecute them, the animal rights activists, with these anti-terror laws. But before the court case, for 3 years, they bugged and they surveyed every aspect of their lives. There was a complete surveillance on this small group of people who were protesting in front of McDonald's, who were shutting off streets to roads to places where there was some form of animal abuse and stuff like that. I mean, normal, let's say, normal democratic protest and certain aspects of civil disobedience. And of course, the court case fell through. I mean, of course, there was no conviction because it was so completely ridiculous. But what happened is that the lives of these 30 people were more or less destroyed.
Crimeless victims.
Well, in this case, you have. So I think that's part of the problem, that you're putting laws and regulations and gray areas into place, which can then easily be misused if in coming years there's more social protest, there's more ecological protest. Everything is in place for a more repressive system, and the only fact that this has not yet happened is that there hasn't been the necessity. But the fact that it's in place, I think, is worrisome enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we asked in our survey was, whether people, we're trying to get at whether people believe, as some of the reports state, that this information gets destroyed in 3 or 5 years. And we found that 92% of the people who responded to our survey thought that the information would be vulnerable to abuse for many years because it may never be completely erased or safeguarded. So nobody trusts that anything ever actually gets destroyed. So I think you make the point that there's more complacency about these practices now during the Obama administration, and I think there are reasons for that. There's a certain sense that probably many people have, that this administration is going to be less prone to abusing the information than perhaps another one might be, or that their motives are good, or that Obama has dialed back the war on terror and curtailed certain abusive practices. He ended torture, and that you could put more faith in this administration. But even for those who believe that, it seems like nobody believes that the information that's gathered by this administration will end with this administration.
Well, didn't we
but also distrust of the state used to be the sign of an intelligent human being. I mean, that used to be, amongst progressives, it was evident that if you understood how the system works, you would have a certain distrust of the state. You wouldn't, just because that's part of individual freedom, isn't it? Mm-hmm. To be skeptical about, how the state interferes. And even then, if you agree with the actions of the state, not to give it the carte blanche. I mean, that was generally understood as the position of a critical, intelligent human being. And if we don't have that, then we have a population of subservient.
Well, but it's not just that. You make the point in your book that in a time when we're all afraid of this inchoate enemy, terror, how do you fight terror? How do you fight a nightmare? there's a presumption that we don't know what's going on, and that if you question what the authorities are doing, you're either underinformed or you're helping the terrorists. And so rather than being an enlightened person, you're someone who's almost a terrorist yourself. Don't you talk about people's fear of being accused of collaboration with the bad guys?
Well, they have been. I mean, The Guardian has been accused of aiding terrorism, not only by politicians, but by many other British newspapers, which I find shocking, even by some British authors. So it's I think today, when you fight for transparency, one of the accusations that come easily is that, so what are you doing? You want to help the terrorists? I mean, it's a knee-jerk reaction, a dangerous one.
There's an article I want to bring up that was written by Yevgeny Morozov a couple of weeks ago, an overview of the whole industry of data, which started in the 1950s. Someone at the Rand Corporation wrote an article who basically saying 3 things are going to happen. One, everything is going to be data, everything is going to be available, everyone's information is going to be in one place. That will lead to normalization of surveillance. So everyone will just think it's normal that they're being surveilled. And the third step is there's going to be imposed conformity, because everyone, as you write in your book, if you have nothing to hide, you're okay. And so as data and monitoring invade people's lives, they feel a pressure to conform. Could you talk about the impulse to conformity that the transparency is creating?
I would like to just go one step back, and one of the amazing things I found out, I've spent the last 15 years looking at the Secret Service archive in Bulgaria, and one of the interesting things is that once surveillance is onto you, so once the focus of the camera or the microphone or whatever it might be is kind of has focused on you, it's nearly impossible to be innocent. It's not only that the presumption of innocence has more or less been lost, because we now have a preemptive system, and that's also a paradigm shift. In the old days, you used to assume that authorities would only become active once there's some kind of reason for suspicion. Now it's a kind of preemptive collecting of data. But the other aspect is that it's actually the fact alone that you're under surveillance already makes you guilty. And the proof of that is that when you read in the margins, because what you have in the Secret Service files, you have the transcripts, and then you have the officer in charge adding kind of his commentary in the margins. The most innocent remarks, because of the context of surveillance, seem dubious. So even if you're actually completely innocent, that innocence can only be explained by the fact that you are hiding something. So to put it very bluntly, it's like in a movie, someone says, I didn't do it, and thus this is proof that he did it, because otherwise why would he claim he didn't do it? And it's that kind of mechanism, and as absurd as it sounds, this is actually one of the most terrifying aspects of surveillance that I noticed in the Bulgarian Secret Service files.
Well, it's funny, because I was looking at something in Penn's history. Arthur Miller, who was the president of the American Penn Center, had a long history of being surveilled, and there was a report when his files were finally opened up in response to a FOIA request. When he married Marilyn Monroe, it was in a Jewish ceremony, and the CIA officers or FBI officers wrote, this religious ceremony, because he was accused of being a communist, and a communist was an atheist. So they said, well, this religious ceremony clearly was sort of trumped up as a front, to try to cover for his atheism. So, as you say, exactly, sort of anything you do, is just seen, as through the prism of the suspicion and the accusations against you.
You've got a line in your book there, or just look into a closed caption TV screen and try not to look guilty. You look like you're just about to murder someone or steal something, once you're on that TV. And then the information is there for eternity to be done with whatever anyone wants. You also mentioned the movie Minority Report, the science fiction film where people are trying to predict well, to look into the future and see crimes and go back and prevent them from happening. In the course of your research for that book, did you actually look into how effective the surveillance and data collection has been in thwarting terrorist acts in Europe?
We
what
did.
did you find?
Well, we did, and that's one of the I think the main arguments against it. If you don't accept the moral argument, and if you don't accept the legal argument, there's actually a very strong efficiency argument, because surveillance has been going on in public places in the UK for quite a long time, and they have different studies that show that it does help once the crime has been committed. It does, of course, help finding the perpetrator, but it has absolutely no effect whatsoever in thwarting crime. What happens basically is that the areas that are under surveillance, then of course these particular areas, that public square or that railway station, has a decrease of crime, but the crime just shifts. So basically, if, for example, the railway station is under complete closed-circuit TV control, then there would be more crime in the back alleys where there's no CCTV, which of course is a fatal argument, because then the next step would be, okay, then we have to have CCTV absolutely everywhere. And the second thing is that a lot of crime, and terrorism is a very typical example, is not committed by people who actually think, how am I going to get away with it? This is not kind of the main motivation of a terrorist. He doesn't, especially not a suicide bomber. You know, a suicide bomber doesn't sit down and thinks, okay, gosh, if the CCTV captures my picture, I'm going to be in trouble. I mean, that's not really the worry terrorists have. So it shows you that in thwarting crime, it's more or less inefficient. So the big question then is, what does it achieve? And what it certainly achieves is that that's another very interesting aspect of these studies. It criminalizes deviant behavior. Because you have all this data information, and one of the interesting things we found out recently, we did another small research for an essay recently, is that the number of crime has been going down, and we studied Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Crime has been going down in these three countries, but the number of people in jail has been going up, has been increasing. And the reason for that is that when you have so much surveillance, you need to justify it by then, of course, solving crime. And because there's not that much crime to go around for such a big bureaucracy and for such a big surveillance effort, deviant kind of small...
I think you mean diverging from normal behavior.
Yeah, I
as
mean small things, really minor things that normally wouldn't be regarded as crime, are then kind of upgraded into crime, and thus you have a perception of rising crime. That's the bizarre thing, or the perverse thing. You have amongst the population, I don't know about the US, but in Germany, for example, the population seems to think that crime is going up, thus welcomes more surveillance, while actually the crime numbers tell a different story.
So in other words, conformity is increasing. So anyone who acts outside of it becomes suspect, and more people like that are being punished. That's so alarming. Could you tell me, this is the basic reason why we're here tonight, what do you think it does to writers to be afraid that your work is being surveilled or that your activities will be hampered? What is the problem for creative people, for their work, and the problem to civilization, more broadly speaking, if writers are hampered?
It depends what kind of writer you're talking about. I think you have different characters. I mean, with me, it's motivating. I mean, there's a wonderful German saying, "Viel Feind, viel Ehr," which means a lot of enemies, a lot of honor. So I think it actually motivates me to. It gives me, I think, and that's probably something that authors discuss around the world. Is our influence diminishing? What is kind of the importance of literature in today's world? And this is, I think, one arena or one area where one could easily argue that it is exactly the authors who need to become active, because this is something which directly affects their work. And it's been motivating to me and to many other colleagues of mine. So in a way, that's a positive thing. But I can well imagine, looking at Eastern Europe, one of the interesting things in Eastern Europe is that after '89, people expected to find a lot of brilliant manuscripts hidden away in the cupboards. This was a general expectation that once there's a free society, all these great works that were written but could not be published, that were censored, would then be found. And that was not the case. There were very, very few books, actually, not more than a dozen in Eastern Europe, that had been written and not published, that were critical, independent, radical. And the reason was, of course, and we've discussed that before, that most of these authors basically succumbed to the conformity that was expected of them. And therefore the self-censorship and the self-regulation is a very dominant aspect, and I think, except for a few exceptions, it affected nearly everyone who had to live through that system for a long period of time. Now we're talking there about of 70 years, in other cases of 45 years. This is just the beginning. I mean, this incredibly fascinating study that you did, this is, I mean, we've been discussing this for not more than 10 years, have we? I mean, seriously. So just imagine what's going to happen if this goes on and it increases and increases in another 10 years or another 20 years.
Yeah, I think there's also a kind of subconscious element of it, of people not even knowing. And there's this, I was reading something that Orhan Pamuk wrote when, I think it was about 30 years ago, when he was a young writer, and he was asked, what are the subjects that you're not writing about, because of the repression in Turkey at the time, and he was embarrassed because he kind of couldn't think of anything, and he realized, well, I don't even think about those things. There are things that I've just kind of written out of my life as a writer almost inherently, that it's not that I've even thought of writing about those things. I've just kind of constructed my world knowing that I can't. And so he couldn't even answer the question. And I think that's what we've sort of shed a light on here is, what's happening at a conscious level? What do people sort of know that they're self-censoring? But what we can answer is, what's at the subconscious level? And how's it going to affect the next generation of writers who sort of grow up in a world knowing that everything they contemplate is going to be sucked up into some big server somewhere in Langley? And what will we be deprived of because of the way that they kind of construct their worldview as the next generation of writers?
And there's a very famous German song, Die Gedanken sind frei, thoughts are free. And this is actually complete nonsense. Because they're not. Because the only way a thought is actually relevant is if it's expressed. And the moment there's censorship, and this expression, whether it's verbal or written, is in a way surveyed, collected, and misused, thinking itself becomes unfree. So to think that there's a division between the thought, the abstract thought, and the expression of the thought, I think is a major mistake.
Well, and then there's also a real quantification on how much thoughts are worth, in the sense that people who expose their thoughts on Facebook, provide ad revenues to Facebook, and then of course Facebook sells its metadata to the NSA. So there's a way in which people's thoughts really do have an increasing number of value on it.
Yeah, well, they didn't sell them to the NSA, they gave them away for free.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry, that was altruistic.
But that might be the next step, yeah.
What do you have a Facebook account?
I do, but I use it just to publicize my own works and articles, and so it's there's nothing personal and there's no thinking involved there.
Well, no, I just asked because I didn't even look for you on Facebook because I assumed you'd be suspicious of it. Why aren't you?
Well, I'm not, because I'm just, in that case, I don't mind if everybody knows that I've published a new article against surveillance. I mean, I'm quite happy for everyone to know. I mean,
so you're assuming.
But I would never ever
they'll
post
know who your friends are. people might post pictures and link them to you.
Yeah, but those are people I think who would want to be known as my friends. I think they're okay with that. Yeah.
Part of the reason I brought that up is that Monday I posted on Facebook that I was going to give this event and discuss how data mining and democracy are connected at the Goethe-Institut. The next thing I knew, my Facebook wall went blank. And I was really startled, and I could read only the news feed, but I couldn't go to my wall. And I posted to my friends, "What's going on? I just posted something about the NSA and data mining, and my Facebook wall is going off." And the next thing I knew, a friend of mine who writes for the Times said, "It's happened to me too." And then we all just sort of thought, "Oh my God, the knock's going to come at the door." And it turned out just to be some glitch that was countrywide, or maybe it was only my friend group. I'll never know. You have a passage in your book about how, in a way, people are flattered that government authorities and spies might take an interest in their least scribblings. Can you talk a bit about people being complicit in their bareness and their transparency, and what you think of that?
Well, of course, the ironic thing is that those people who would actually be involved in a serious conspiracy wouldn't be flattered, and therefore they wouldn't publicize anything, while those people who are flattered are those people who are actually not doing anything of any political relevance. So in a way, this is again proof of the complete inefficiency, I mean, just in terms of police work, the complete inefficiency, because I think that the new generation now, and talking to my 17-year-old daughter, it's very clear. She completely understands that anything she posts on Facebook, anything on WhatsApp or SMS or whatever is kind of generally known. I mean, she has that understanding that there's this line between what is public and what is private. So if she were to be involved in any kind of political action, she would absolutely understand that she would completely avoid any kind of form of digital communication. So I think in a way, there are many, many ways to not be part of that surveillance system, especially if you're doing something that you don't want people to know. It's not that difficult. And of course, the question of encryption, encryption is a very, very complex thing, because these backdoors that you mentioned are not backdoors that, I mean, they were installed by different intelligence communities, but of course they're backdoors that exist for everyone. So the security system in the internet is generally affected. So if these backdoors exist, they can also be used by people who have a criminal interest,
nefarious intents,
all sorts of nefarious intents, and thus there's going to be an ongoing kind of Cold War of encryption, and different people, like hackers, for example, are in certain moments winning the battle. So, I mean, encryption, there's going to be this really crazy, the encryption of the encryption of the encryption. Even now it's reached an enormous complexity.
Time magazine just did a cover a couple of weeks ago, The Deep Web, just about how people can get into those backdoors and wreak lots of havoc. I want to ask one more question to Suzanne, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And the question was just, until I heard about Ilija Trojanow's case, I didn't think America was a country that barred the door to writers. And I guess that was really naive. So I'm just asking you, do you know of other instances? Is it common? Does it happen a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it was an issue that we worked on pretty extensively during the Bush administration, with a good number of cases. The Tariq Ramadan case is probably the most prominent. The Obama administration overturned some of those denials and allowed some of those people, including Ramadan, to enter the country. And it's not, our work on these cases hasn't been as active since. So this case stood out for us as something unusual. I mean, it's something also historically that Penn's worked on going back to the 50s, and people like Garcia Marquez and Doris Lessing, and and many other luminaries. So you're in good company. You should feel good in that sense. That there's some very distinguished writers who've been kept out of this country. But it's it's something that we do monitor closely. I think for most Americans and people I've spoken to about, they're pretty shocked actually with the idea that somebody kind of on his way to a German studies conference, might get barred at the door who has a valid visa. And so I think that's why we saw it did get some publicity. It's not something most Americans kind of think is happening. And it's also, there's incredible opacity about why it's happening and whether this is really systematic. And, of course, it's very suspicious because of Ilya's role in this public letter to Chancellor Merkel. But, I'm not sure any of us really knows for sure whether this was some bizarre snafu of incompetence or really a masterful kind of connecting of dots, to stop him in his tracks down in Brazil, and we may never know.
Just to add one sentence, after it happened, several people actually did contact me saying that they had experienced similar things. Just to give you one example, there's an Austrian author called Gabriel Kuhn, who has written books on two subjects. He specialized on two subjects. One is piracy in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, and the other one is the connection between post-structuralism and anarchism, which seems to be a rather kind of academic question, at least to me. But he published a book in the US, and he was going to do kind of a reading tour, and he was barred access, and that was 2010, and since then he hasn't been allowed into the country, and that was one of about half a dozen of cases that came to my attention.
For writing about structuralism?
Post-structuralism.
It was structuralism.
Structuralism was okay, but
right.
post-structuralism is really one step too many. Yeah.
I wish they'd kept them out before I went to in college. All right, so, thank you both, but do we have questions from the audience? You, sir? Do we have a microphone, or? Well, I'll just untag that. And just say who you are, if you could.
Micro's up. Okay. I'm Peter Wittig. I'm here as a reader of Mr. Trojanow's wonderful books, but also I'm the German ambassador to the UN. And in that capacity, I feel motivated to take up one or 2 points that you made. But first of all, I think you, three of you, thank you for a most stimulating discussion. You brought out, I think, one of the most pressing challenges for all our societies in the digital age, be it the US or Germany, to close the widening gap between what is technologically possible, and it's the technology is moving fast in terms of surveillance on the one hand, and creating a political framework to protect the rights of the citizens, the human rights, the right to privacy. And this technology has outpaced politics, and I think that's the conundrum that we are facing. One of the maybe positive fallouts of the NSA scandal and the Merkel affair is that awareness here, including on the Hill, is growing that the NSA and similar organizations have to be ruled in, checked. There has to be a political architecture that controls those agencies in order to reestablish the balance between security interests, which might be legitimate, and the human rights. And I just want to challenge one or 2 points that you made, Mr. Trojanow. First of all, the Foreign Office was active in your case of access to the US being denied, just to assure you that we just didn't watch it happen. And secondly, I cannot entirely agree when you say the Merkel government has been totally inactive. There have been a lot of contacts with the US even before the Merkel affair broke. So there was a lively dialogue with the US on those issues. And thirdly, I want to share with you an aspect of my work at the UN that is, I think, pertinent here. In the last days, we introduced a resolution in the General Assembly of the UN on the rights to privacy in the digital age. So it's very relevant for our topic here. And it aims at sort of reaffirming the human right to privacy that is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, long-standing rights, and make them applicable to the digital age. And that concerns sort of online and offline. We feel that this is probably one of the major challenges also for human rights policy to apply the protection of human rights to the digital age. And we also include extraterritorial surveillance in that. And we have a lively discussion in the UN. You can imagine the US is participating in that. The Brits are. So we're having a very good, lively discussion. And I hope this takes us forward in terms of awareness of the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Second question. Yes?
Christine de Vallecart, formerly of SUNY. Mr. Trojanow, in your description of the incident at the Brazil airport, I read in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, but it must be in other books, you insist in particular on the ohne Angabe der Gründe. And this is typical for the whole situation. Now, would you agree with me, mutatis mutandis, that the most modern writer is Niccolò Machiavelli? Because when you prescribe the prince, it is not today, power is not concentrated in one tyrant or something like that, which would be easy to do away with. But it is all invasive, and the characteristics of the advices of Machiavelli to the prince is never give any reason. You are not answerable to anybody, and make your actions and decisions totally unpredictable, so that nobody can speculate and say he's going to do that, or probably is going to do that. I think that Machiavelli is the most modern writer. Would you agree with that, Lopez? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure what kind of the list of most modern writers is, but I would certainly agree that I think to give a reason means to diminish your power. So that is why transparency is so important, because only when reasons are given do you actually have any kind of recourse. So, of course, when we're talking about a state within a state, which has amassed powers which are not under control any longer, as I believe, then of course not giving an explanation has to be part and parcel of their actions. Yes. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm very glad that the ambassador came, and I'm thankful for whatever you might have done in my case. But there are many things I could point out that the German government is not doing, but we'll not get into that. Yeah.
So you, sir?
I wonder whether our guest from Germany could tell us a little about civil attitudes in Europe towards the surveillance issues. We've heard a lot about American writers and the American public, but I think it's a little different in Europe, isn't it?
It's actually very, very different from one state to the other. At the Frankfurt Book Fair, I had the opportunity to speak to several colleagues from different countries, and it was fascinating how much it differs. For example, a French publisher told me that it's not an issue at all in France, and that actually very few, even these famous French intellectuals who are normally very keen to immediately jump on board any kind of political issue of the day, they've been mostly silent. In England, it's horrific. I mean, there's been not only no sensibility, but a real backlash against a few media organizations and individuals who have been concerned with this. In Germany, I mean, those of us who are active think that there's not enough attention to the question, but it seems to be more developed than in neighboring countries. Now, one of the bizarre things is that sometimes people ask me, non-Germans ask me, so why is it that you Germans are so obsessed with this issue? It's nearly as if there's a certain accusation involved. And I would actually, if I wasn't as polite as I am, I would actually like to tell them, listen, after Gestapo and Stasi, if the German society hasn't learned that surveillance is a bad thing, what was the 20th century for? I mean, why did we waste the most horrendous century in the history of mankind and the most horrible history, the German history of the 20th century, if we didn't at least learn a few lessons, and that is, for example, to be skeptical of secret services and surveillance, I find it actually absolutely necessary and logical that the German population would at least be partly sensitized and careful about these issues, and I feel that they should be more.
Any other questions? Yes, hand in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel and for the discussion. It seems to me that there are coincidental surveillance regimes. I mean, we're talking primarily about the militarized surveillance regime that's enforced at the borders. But I don't hear as much discussion about the kind of surveillance regimes that exist, for instance, in large corporations, where internal emails of all the employees become the property of the corporations, where monitoring of all activities within the bounds of the property of the owners are maintained, and the employees have no control once they sign basically a term of usage, which is of their person or their contribution as employees to the company. But I think also there should be this discussion about the terms of usage that people sign, essentially, when they join something like Facebook, which is a very subtle means of obtaining complicity for systems that are deeply invasive of human rights, property rights, personal rights, civil liberties in general. And I think that there's a terrible fear on the side of the corporate syndicates that their regimes might be endangered by this discourse on the militarized governmental, national, and international regimes of surveillance. And the last thing I would like to mention is that in Lower Manhattan during Occupy was discovered that there's at least a $10 billion surveillance operation that involves everyone from the CIA, Homeland Security, DNI, and down to and including corporate hired contractors and the NYPD, and this is illegal. It's supposed to never happen here. These things are happening. So,
well, thank you very much for raising that question. It's just that there's so many aspects to this issue that we couldn't cover them all. But when we were talking about chilling effect, this is actually one area where we know how the chilling effect works, and that is in corporations. And when you read studies about how people are forced into complete subservience in big companies, it's exactly through that phenomena that you described. And there's incredible surveillance in companies, yeah, and it's basically done away with a lot of civil rights. But they're, of course, signed away, as you pointed out. They're signed away voluntarily, so people can claim, this is just part of contract
Right, it's not,
contract
and it's also
law.
not limited to employees, just as part of using platforms or email service providers, social media networks, there's great forfeiture of privacy that's inherent in that. And I mean, you sort of commented about your 17-year-old daughter and that she now knows enough if she wanted to do anything political, she'd keep it off her digital media platforms. But I think there's going to be a real question of how she does it, because the phone isn't safe. Every piece of mail is being photographed. Every social network site and email platform is monitorable. There's surveillance cameras now becoming ever more pervasive. So, maybe it's the carrier pigeon that she can rely on to communicate with her consorts in organizing an environmental rally or an animal rights rally. But I think, there's a real question about whether and how any kind of challenging or potentially subversive activity can go on undetected. And if it can't, what does that mean?
It's heartening to think that more people in Germany are aware of the dangers of surveillance, or more active against it if they are than here. But to relate back to the question that the audience member asked, I yesterday got just in my Twitter feed, a Twitter from a company called M-Spy. And I thought it was a joke. I thought it was something from The Onion. And it said, take full control of what's going on in your home. Keep your children safe online and offline. Instantly detect any harmful situation and put a stop to it. Home premium tablet and cell phone spyware has state-of-the-art features to help you protect your loved ones. And then it said, or prevent the risk of data leaks or any unwanted behavior at work. M-Spy business tablet and cell phone tracking software allows you to monitor your employees, keep track of their productivity in and out of the office, and timely address policy or data security breaches. And I emailed them back, is this for real? Because I thought I was being tricked and it was a joke. And completely earnestly, they instantly tweeted back, it is. Monitoring technologies are gaining more and more popularity with the general public, and they are openly available as well. And I don't think this was a gag. I think it's true.
You're going to be the 17th National Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, the people are not detecting it as a violation or an endangerment of their individual rights. And that's the problem we're here to address. Do we have time for one more question, or should we get...
One more.
Oh, one more question, yes.
As happy as I am to have Mr. Trojanow here, there was one aspect missing in the whole discussion that, from what comes to my mind immediately, does anyone seriously believe that Mrs. Merkel's or French president's or the Spanish Prime Minister's cell phone was tapped for security reasons? Seriously? Of course not. Most of this surveillance and spying is done, and this is what which I'm told by all my contacts in the intelligence community, I'm a journalist, is most of is the framework that came with the Patriot Act and the equivalents of the Patriot Act in all the other countries, that the respective intelligence agencies just took the freedoms, these new freedoms that they got with these programs, and they put it to work also for spying for economic reasons, and surveillance for purely economic reasons. And that's just one aspect that I find somewhat frustrating, that we never talk about that. We talk about, privacy, that's all good, but it's kind of cute, because I think this is the very troubling aspect, and it has a lot to do, of course, with history, what happened after 45, with what we call the Five Eyes. So this is not something new. I mean, all these revelations, but it's somewhat, we're talking about this like this just came all out. I mean, this has been in various forms. This has been going on for a long, long time.
Well, do you have
thoughts?
But the explosion is two-sided. It's not only about the security reasons, it's all about purely economic reasons.
Yeah, although I would completely agree with you that, of course, there's some kind of industrial and economic espionage going on, and it's certainly important. I beg to disagree that this is nothing new. I think you're missing out on the point that this is a real paradigm shift, and it's a paradigm shift for two reasons. One is what I said, it's preemptive. Even with economic espionage or industrial espionage, there's a certain specific reason for you to spy on another company or another foreign head of state or whatever. There is a certain motivation, there's a causality between your spying and the person you're spying on. The most troubling aspect of this whole development is that this is a preemptive data collection of all communication of every citizen, which has nothing to do with spying whatsoever, because what would be the use of that? What's the point of collecting all the emails that everybody in the society writes? I think that is very clearly connected to what we discussed, technological possibility and potential repressive possibilities in years to come. And the second thing, I think the paradigm shift is just the enormous quantity of what is happening. I mean, of course, spying has been going on, but it was, individual cases, a few people involved, but the quantity of what's happening now is just mind-boggling. So I think that has a different kind of, it has reached a different level.
Thank you all so much for being such an engaged audience. Thank you to our guests, Ilija Trojanow and Suzanne Nossel. And let's all get some wine.